Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ASF Weekly Science Podcast. I'm Alicia Halliday, the Chief Science Officer, and I'm excited to tell you about 3 studies that came out this week. The first one you probably heard about already. It's about broccoli extract in autism. It received a lot of attention in the press, and even Good Morning America had a segment on it. It was published in a pretty highly respected journal, and while it's too early to tell about its direct influence, hopefully it will lead to more research. One of the study authors, Andy Zimmerman, has been previously studying and published on what is known as the fever effect. This is an effect reported from parents and then documented and studied in the scientific literature, where some children with autism show an improvement of symptoms during a fever. He's been dedicated to understanding this more for years, and he's turned to the molecular mechanism of fever for more answers. One compound called sulforaphane induces what is called the heat shock response in cells. This is a molecular mechanism that fever also produces. This sulforaphane is found in certain vegetables. These include Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, bok choy, kale, collards. You get the idea. But the highest concentration is found in broccoli sprouts. So that's how the authors went about isolating sulforaphane through broccoli sprouts. They studied the effects of small amounts of purified sulforaphane on about 24 boys with autism, about 17 years old. They looked at irritability, hyperactivity, stereotypy, and certain measures of social responsiveness during 18 weeks of treatment and then for 4 weeks after the treatment stopped. Observations were made directly by the doctors and then also on parent reports who filled out questionnaires about the boys' behavior. At about a month into treatment, there was an improvement in behavior in both groups receiving both the sulforaphane and the placebo. This is what is called the placebo response and is seen in almost every single clinical trial of a psychiatric medication. By 2 months into treatment, the reduction in behaviors such as irritability, stereotypy, hyperactivity, and an improvement in the behaviors around communication and motivation were greater in those on the treatment or the sulforaphane versus the placebo. Once they went off this quote-unquote medication, the behaviors went back to where they were before the treatment started. A few things to mention. First and foremost, the science had to do some pretty serious chemical extractions of the broccoli sprouts in order to procure the sulforaphane, and it's nearly impossible to eat enough sprouts to produce a similar effect. However, I also want to emphasize these vegetables are good for you. They're rich in vitamins and minerals. No doctor would ever tell you not to eat these foods, so please eat them. It's not like they're extracted from Big Macs, but healthy consumption of these foods will not reverse symptoms of autism. Sorry. Second, a high proportion of individuals in the study were classified as fever responders, meaning they're the ones that showed improvements after fever. So if the way sulforaphane works is similar to the fever response, this could actually represent a subgroup, meaning we shouldn't assume that this will work for everyone with ASD. Finally, the sample size was small, there was a placebo effect, and it only included boys. But the glass is half full for me. I think it's encouraging, and it's especially gratifying to see that Dr. Zimmerman is following through with the original finding of the fever effect and trying to figure out what exactly is going on. The second study I want to tell you about today uses another leafy plant to study autism, trees. Well, kind of. The High-Risk Baby Sibling Research Consortium used a statistical analysis called Classification and Regression Tree, or CART, to pull out features of high-risk SIBs that most accurately identify children at 36 months that will go on to later be diagnosed with ASD at 36 months. They used a shared database from data on over 719 high-risk siblings on the Autism Diagnostic Observation Scale, or ADOS. Using this CART analysis, researchers were able to accurately identify over half of 13-month infants who would later go on to receive a diagnosis of autism. They did this through 3 branches of the tree, and these branches included poorly modulated eye contact, not giving or offering objects to others to share, and limited other emotional and communicative gestures besides pointing. The authors, particularly Kaza Charwarska at Yale, want you to know that it wasn't just one of these things, it was the combination of all three that most accurately predicted the outcome of autism. Specifically, 18-month-olds with these three branches were 14.7 times more likely to develop autism. This could be a strong predictive tool, but remember, this study only looked at high-risk infants. Most individuals with autism are not high-risk infants or high-risk siblings. Also, it really wasn't that good at predicting those individuals who didn't have autism but had some challenging behaviors that didn't qualify as an autism diagnosis but were still problematic. Okay, finally, one last study. It's not so deep into science, but don't worry, it was a scientific study. It came out of the UK and investigated the attitudes and perspectives on community involvement in research from researchers, clinicians, people with ASD, and finally, family members. Because the ultimate goal of basic science is to translate it into benefits for people with autism, it's important to engage and include members of the autism community into these translational efforts. However, very little has been done to actually determine what the level of involvement has been so far, other than just participation in research. So what they found was actually fascinating. Researchers perceive themselves to be engaged with the scientific community, but community members, most notably autistic people and their families, did not share this same view. Specifically, autistic adults and their family members were more often dissatisfied with community engagement and in research, and actually their clinicians and researchers were for the most part satisfied with it. They, meaning autistic families and individuals, reported that researchers were not proactive enough. They don't feel valued. Research findings were hard to understand, and actually the studies were not really rooted in real-life problems of people with ASD. Finally, some people felt like they were a little bit like monkeys in a zoo. So on the other hand, the researchers often saw most community members as passive participants rather than actively involved in the full scope of research. It's pretty likely that these two things are probably related. So a family member with autism feels somewhat disconnected from research, and the researcher themselves views the families and the individuals with autism kind of in a passive way. It's not uncommon. I was just at the NIMH Alliance for Research Progress meeting, and improving the relationship and the role of individuals in the research process is one of the goals of an organization called PCORI. It stands for Patient Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and it's being included on many NIH grants. Thanks for listening to this week's Science Roundup. If you have any questions, ideas, or comments, please feel free to reach out to me at ahalliday@autismsciencefoundation.org. Also, visit the ASF website where you can read new recipes for grilled Brussels sprouts and broccoli and rice casserole. Talk to you next week.